You remember when you've had those sort of thoughts, on those nights where you can't go to sleep because nobody really seems to understand. And you don't even know why you're there, what difference you may be making. Your best of intentions have been completely misunderstood. And you feel so all alone. You don't really feel like there's any respect, to say nothing of finding no pity as our Lord did. He was the royal majesty of the kingdom, and he stood right in front of them in the fullness of God's love and found no pity at the people he persecuted. So we all go through times like this, where we just can't sleep, where we feel awful for days and weeks and months, and this can especially happen to those brothers and sisters in whose purview the ecclesia seeks its stability. The ones that are a little bit older, who have worked so hard in the vineyard, in a very deliberate kind of care to make sure that the flock that they are in, that they are a part of as sheep and also as shepherds in their varying roles, make sure that that flock is happy and peaceful, and yet we all live together in a condition where human nature tumbles us around, and the chips are broken off, and when those sharp edges are worn, we feel it, it hurts, we're uncomfortable, it keeps us awake, we wonder what's going on, but it's all a part of the production of jewels in God's plan in ecclesial life. So we know that, but it doesn't really mitigate the severity or the extreme feelings we have when our best of intentions have been completely misunderstood. Everybody feels like this from time to time. So today we're going to turn our attention to comfort in offense. Offenses are always there. How easy it is to offend without meaning to, or to be offended when there was no intention on the part of the person who offends us. And all of this, like all the other things we've been thinking about yesterday, are common in human interaction and have very little meaning in life unless there is reconciliation in the kingdom. So we're not only thinking, when we think about offense, we are not only thinking about the negative effects of offense on us, but we're thinking about the sweetness, the beauty of reconciliation. Well, this would apply to you as an individual and the conflicts within. It applies to us in family, husbands and wives, and the conflicts that exist there. It applies to ecclesias and the fears within and the conflicts without, and also to the brotherhood, where there's disparity, there's differences in judgment, there's a question about whose judgment is more righteous than whose, and all these things are in the mixture of offenses and the ideal of reconciliation. You know, Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, if you have aught against your brother, you leave your gift at the altar and go and reconcile with him, as if to say, what I'm looking for is reconciliation, not bread and wine. Bread and wine is a symbol of something which, if you don't practice, makes it meaningless at the altar. And the writer of the Hebrews said, at the end of his message, Christ is our altar. So when we break bread, that's our altar. That's our offering to God. The offering doesn't mean much in the absence, especially if it's the deliberate, intentional absence of reconciliation. You can't speak about offense without also spiritually understanding the need for reconciliation. Well, if God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, how meaningful should that be to those of us who accept that reconciliation at the table of the Lord, and then find it a glaring necessity in our relationships in marriage, brethren, in the ecclesia, and also in the larger community of Christadelphians, not only in our country, but in this big house of God, in which there are many rooms worldwide, where God means to have his light shining in the stability and peace of the Spirit of Christ. So let's look at what sets up reconciliation in the kingdom. Once again, returning to my grandson, Silas. He once sat down at the kitchen table and drew a picture of this thing. Because I had said to him, what would you like us to make in the shop? And so he sat down and drew this. Well, knowing Silas, it's easy to understand why his creation here, this thing that came straight from his brain stem, out through his hand into a drawing, why that would have that expression on his face. Because this is, in some respects, a metaphor of Silas's take on life. Like I said, he tends to live in a state of relatively high dudgeon. We believe it's because he's so talented and so cute and so intelligent that he just can't manage a lesser world, the lesser world around him in which he's been forced to live. So I made him his wooden, woeful sculpture. There's like woeful and chore in there somewhere in those words. So, that's the way we feel, isn't it? When things are just not coming our way. We're not getting our way. That's the way we feel. And we can be pretty defensive in those times. And we can be quite combative even, if that's what we feel is called for in that situation. And then there's some times where everything's all so topsy-turvy, helter-skelter, that we just feel like, there aren't any words to describe it. So it's interesting how out of the mouths of babes come these kind of realizations or these depictions of life as it is when you're an adult. Shouldn't seem so puerile anymore, but really aren't we just kind of children all grown up and with all those same little insecure feelings and hurt feelings and desires to be fulfilled and so on. So let's take a closer look at offenses and judgment. I'm going to make a testimony this morning now of a friend who I said on early yesterday would remain anonymous until we speak about it. This is a close friend of mine, and in a minute I'll tell you why. When I was in college, this friend came to my assistance. I was, like I said earlier, I was full of fear and had an extreme level of personal insecurity for a whole lot of different reasons. I couldn't imagine myself ever even getting married. I felt like I was so unappealing, unattractive, and worthless. I had been advised by a counselor not to try to go to college because it just didn't seem from my high school record that college would do anything for such a relatively inhibited intellect. So this friend came to my assistance. As soon as I got into college, I started getting input from him, and his input started to appeal to me, got in my brain, wired me differently, to the point where I spent 3 years of the 4 I was in college writing essays that were prompted by the support given to me by this friend. So we got real close in college, and I learned a lot from him. He was an older brother. This was that brother. I read everything I could get my hands on that he wrote. And there was something about the exuberance and the power that came from the writing that he wrote about the kingdom, about all these different things and the ways of providence, and Nazareth revisited, and the life and works of Dr. Thomas, and so many different things. And especially what really got me was this little relatively obscure book called England's Ruin, in which he was answering a book called Merry England, written by Mr. Blatchford, in which he read this book. It fried his brain, and in typical fashion, he had to write a book to counteract all these thoughts and feelings he had from somebody that suggested that socialism would be the complete making of the British Isles and save the world, socialism. I think there's some people that feel that way in America these days. Well, that fried his brain. He couldn't handle it. So he wrote a book to counteract it called England's Ruin. And at the end of that, there was a chapter devoted to something that that called attention to all the failed governments and charismatic kings and leaders and presidents of nations gone by, that was the real solution. A king that stood in such sharp contrast to human kings. And the title of that chapter was The Final Consolation. I'm sure some of you have read it. If you haven't read it, find a copy. Ask Shannon. He'll find a copy for you and read that. It may strike you as being a different picture of the kingdom than the one you've envisioned, but that's okay. We all have our own personal pictures. When I read that, that was my man. Robert Roberts was my best friend, among all those other things that I read. Well, this is a picture of Robert Roberts a few days before he died in San Francisco. It was in very close proximity to a conclusion that had come from a debate that he was in that he didn't expect. It was a disparity among brethren that he worked all his life to prevent. And now it had come to the fore by circumstance in his life in a way that he never dreamed it would. He did everything that he could think of to do to stop it, and yet it took hold and has been with us to this day like a bad disease, preventing us from all coming together in the way that we long to be in the sweetness of fellowship. So when I saw this picture and realized that this was taken just a few days before he died, I started to cry. Something had hurt my brother really bad, and it's written all over his face. You can see it if you look at him. You can see what killed him. His heart failed. And it failed the morning after somebody had made an idle comment in a Bible class that challenged him in a controversy that he thought was settled so many years ago. The next morning they found him dead on the floor of his hotel room. This is a very interesting thing to think about, but it was personally important to me to understand what had happened. So then I somewhere around the same time, but it wasn't directly connected to seeing this picture, I found in a book a writing called A Letter to My Enemies that he had written 13 years earlier before the debate, before he had died. And I saw that, a letter to my enemies. Why would he write such a thing? Why would anybody take the trouble to write a letter to their enemies? Well, the most simplistic reason, and you know this as well as I do, would be that they won't let you talk to them. You need to sit down and talk, just like Jesus said to you. Go talk to your brother, between you and him alone. See if you can work it out. Say you're sorry. Ask him to say he's sorry. Tell him what he did that was wrong, that's made you so upset. If he's humble, he'll say, I didn't need to do that. You'll reach an understanding. You'll be able to say you're sorry. And it all goes away. It evaporates in the air. That's the beauty of forgiveness. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. Whatever the sin, whatever the problem, whatever the battle, whatever the conflict, forgiveness just makes it evaporate and the sun shines again. So when you can't do that, what do? Well, if you try to write a letter, it's kind of hard to convey all those expressions that come through in communication. You can't see a smile is trying to be on somebody's eyes. You can't feel the warmth in a hurt voice. You can't tell what you really need to do sometimes if all there are cold words on a piece of neutral paper. But I think Robert Roberts had a desire to reconcile. What he wanted in his heart, like you do when you get hurt, is to make it go away with reconciliation. This operates inside. You need to reconcile yourself in the same way that Christ did internally when he went to the cross. It happens in marriage when you misunderstand each other, and these things can get very serious, and the feelings get involved, and you have this great sense of disparity, this chasm that seems to be like a black pit, and there's no way to traverse it. But when this happens to you, do you not really know, knowing Christ, that reconciliation is really the most important thing? If only you could, it would all come back. All the beauty of sunlight and a beautiful day like a morning without clouds would be there for yours to take in the peace of love. So I think that's why he wrote this letter. I'm going to read an excerpt from this letter to you so you can get a sense of what's on his mind and the things that he points to in the points he makes. Recognizing Christ's control, he says, I greet you with the best of good wishes. There it is, right at the start. The best of good wishes. My greeting may not be acceptable. It's nevertheless sincere, I assure you. I can pray, and this I do. Rarely do I bend my knee before the Maker of us all without asking him to open your eyes, to bring your steps into paths of wisdom and love. He says, expect persecution. This is an understanding we all have, but we seldom kind of realize until it happens. When I was quite young, I was smitten with the beauty of the popular dictum that it was a good thing and a thing to aim at to have no enemies. I worked under the power of this idea for a good while. But having the Bible standard before me in all things, I came to see this futility and to perceive the reason of the saying of Christ, woe unto you when all men shall speak well of you. Here he's acknowledging it's very easy to be misunderstood. You know that. If you follow Christ, you know how easy your best intentions to follow him can so easily be misunderstood. So we don't want to be eye servants and men pleasers. We're not in this for status. Our role is not a position of status. It's a role of responsible protection and the enhancement of stability and peace. So he says, I found it impossible to avoid giving offense. Impossible. And after many struggles against the inevitable, I quietly and grimly surrendered to the inevitable. I saw that I could not prevent the making of enemies without becoming an eye servant and a pleaser of men. That's how men get the praise of other men. They're eye servants. They serve the purview of the way other people look at them, and it's all false. And they try to please men instead of pleasing God. Pleasing God is what Jesus did, and he did not get the praise of men for it. I therefore made up my mind to accept enmity. I do not mean to give up the idea of being friendly. The oppositions were hurtful. Not able to carry myself toward you as I should desire. Between chronic physical discomfort of body, that didn't go in the record for us. We don't read about Robert Roberts' discomforts physically. And the grimness begotten of collision with opposition. The grimness begotten of collision with opposition. And to constant action in one line of things, I realized that I must appear a very repugnant person in your eyes, notwithstanding my strong desire and best efforts to sustain a different part. He found himself in Paul's position, weak in countenance and contemptible in speech. Don't say anything. We don't even want to hear one word out of your mouth. But then he recognizes the importance of principle and saying, please do not bring charges about which I cannot own. Don't point your finger at me with things that you think are wrong with me, and they're not. I do not and have not aimed at personal exaltation. This is what they held against Jesus, the authority with which he spoke. Personal exaltation. I enjoy not and never have enjoyed the position into which circumstances have forced me. I don't think there's one arranging brother in the world who has a good heart, a heart that's right toward God and applied to his word, that doesn't understand that circumstances, not intentional design, but circumstances have placed them in the position that they are in which they are forced to make adjudication and judgments and talk about the comings and goings of ecclesial life in a way that creates the need for some actions in some cases or some judgments, the kind that Paul said we have to make if we expect to be in the kingdom. It's all a matter of circumstances, and we are forced into that position. This has, the record that I know anyway, has killed recording brothers for the work that they do and the misunderstandings that break their heart. This is apparently a common experience. I'm sure that happened to him. I'm anxious only for the ascendancy of principles, and could hide me out of sight if they were exalted. So let God's word be the final say in all judgments, in all guidance, in all standards that we hold, and don't go beyond what is written. importance of truth. This is where we stand. This is our banner in the world. Men who rejoice in the truth are not to be mistaken with those whom personal elevation is a more controlling influence. If I've been compelled to take a prominent offensive part, it has been to my sorrow. So little has been a satisfaction in the sense of your surmises that I have felt the greatest kindness God could show me would be to lay me where all his servants rest, while the present confusion reigns upon the earth. Well, I don't know about you, but I have shared all of these thoughts simply by proximity in my role to the ecclesia. I didn't mean for it to be that way. I got older without realizing that would happen. In the abstract, when I was young, I kind of knew I would develop some age at some point in life, but it came on me a lot faster than I thought it would. And in that, responsibilities and a role I didn't foresee and circumstances that have taken me to those nights I was speaking about, and in the disposition of all these things he points to. And if you are my age and you have been in that role in your ecclesia, you full well know what I'm talking about. Younger brothers, don't be under any illusion. This is your lot in life in the ecclesia. It will happen. It's normal. It's intentional from heaven. And it's there to give us the experience we will need to have the same controlling influence in the kingdom, when instead of being helpless in an ecclesia, we will have all the power of Christ's disposition and physical presence in this world, in immortality, to bring peace on earth and goodwill toward men, straight as emissaries from the mouth of the law that proceed from Christ's throne. In all that, there's the importance of mercy, he says. And now, if my whole work and my whole influence to promote the truth in public and private, in theory and in practice, I thought we were having a serious conversation here. I don't have my slide. Okay. Excuse Siri. At least she didn't show up there. See if I can get myself back into that mode. And now, if my whole work and my whole influence to promote the truth in public and in private, in theory and in practice, ought you not to be merciful to what you may consider to be my infirmities? Ought you not to help in any way in your power, instead of trying to weaken and hinder by unfriendly words and deeds? So, as usual, God's Word addresses this particular issue because it was the environment into which he placed his Son, so that when his Son sat at his right hand and then spent the next 2,000 years looking at his ecclesial life and looking at the world and seeing one kingdom come and go and watching the way men work in their competitions and in their status with each other and in their ambitions, watching all that for 2,000 years, having gone through that tumbling in his experience with the Pharisees, will be ready, really will be ready, when he sits on the throne to make the law that will be applicable in every nook and cranny of human nature as it continues to assert itself against the will of Christ in the kingdom. That's the throne that you will share with Christ. So you need this experience in order to understand how to work in that environment when it's not an ecclesia, a house of God with many rooms. It's the entirety of the earth, a global ecclesia in which all men and women in the earth are now subject to the rule of the head, which is no longer in heaven, but with us in Jerusalem. So God says of that, listen to me, you who know righteousness, you people in whose heart is my law. You recognize that line, don't you? Straight from Hebrews, where God says, I made a new covenant with you, and that is, I would write my word upon your heart. That's the new covenant. I wrote it in a law and tablets of stone before, and I made a good example of the breach thereof in the nation of Israel. But now my Son has come, and he's at my right hand, and I am writing this on your heart. And how does he do that? He does it by your application, your personal application to his word. The more you can take that into your mind, and in the Bible, heart means mind, and think about it and follow through with reasons and ramifications and conclusions that lead to good spiritual judgment, spiritual reasoning and judgment, you know righteousness. And those are the people with whom God makes his covenant. This is a covenant of life and all things. Peace. Life and peace. Do not fear the reproach of men, or be afraid of their insults. And do not, as Psalm 15 says, take up a reproach against your brother. It works both ways. For moth will eat them up like a garment, and worm will eat them like wool. But my righteousness will be forever, and my salvation from generation to generation. How does God put that all in the context of what we're thinking about this weekend? Even I, the God of heaven and earth, the creator and sustainer of the universe, that God, Yahweh, the one who manifested in his Son will manifest himself in the end of myriads and myriads of people. Even I, am he who comforts you with the promise of the righteousness that you seek. That righteousness that you seek in your marriage, in yourself, in your marriage, in the ecclesia, and in the brotherhood. God is comforting us with the promise of that righteousness. And he'll keep his promise. So let's take a closer look at the second letter to Corinth. Let's return to this verse where he opens his letter by mentioning comfort so many times, and he says, the Father of mercies is the God of all comforts. There's obviously a direct relationship between the application of mercy and handling all afflictions with this comfort, handling the God of all comfort who comforts us in all our affliction. And you remember that we noticed that affliction is a big part of his point in opening the second letter. Well, there's a reason for that. And the reason is that the first letter addressed various kinds of conflicts in the ecclesia that involved offenses and judgments that became an affliction to him and the ecclesia that he had to resolve. And it hurt everybody's feelings, hurt him to write the letters, we already said, hurt them to read it, hurt them to act upon it and to make judgments that he asked them to make. So when he wrote the second letter, he's in recovery mode. He's seeking reconciliation with the second letter. That's the reason there's a second letter, if you read it carefully. And in the application of the principles that he sent them in the first letter, there was a steady wind of accusations that came back at him, resulting into this. He was forced into self-defense in his effort to reconcile, just like Robert Roberts attempted to do in his letter to his enemies. He was forced into self-defense, not wanting to, but resorting to boasting 29 times in the second letter. He said, I shouldn't be saying this, but look at what I've done. Look at what I've suffered. Look at what I've tried to do. He didn't want to speak well of himself, but he was forced into self-defense because of the accusations that had been made against him. And he was trying, it was like the most earnest appeal he could think of to say, this is who I really am. Can you please trust my words when I say these are my best intentions? And I mean it. I mean the best for you. I love you. It was all out of love that I wrote this. It hurt me to write it, but I did. And now if you listen to what I say, things will settle down and you'll have the peace that you seek. If you just listen to what I say. Let's take a closer look at what caused that conflict in the first place. In the first letter, it was discord and dissipation. Discord and dissipation. Jesus speaks about discord and dissipation as being characteristic of ecclesial life in the vineyard in the last days. And this is how he puts it. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed. This is in our times. So we think, well, Christ is not back yet. And begins to beat his fellow servants. That's the discord. And eats and drink with drunkards. That's the dissipation. Well, then that's a real serious problem. And he describes it that way. Can you think of two words that would outline what we are dealing with in ecclesial life and in the brotherhood and even in our families more than discord and dissipation? Discord is all the conflict, the argumentation, the disparity, the misunderstandings, the failure in words, the bad emails, the angry letters, all those things. And the dissipation comes to us straight, expressly from the world, piped into our homes through the internet, through televisions, total dissipation, moral dissipation, and the advertisements and glamorization of dissipation to the point where our kids don't even know the difference between right and wrong. They're so completely exposed to it all day, every day. Discord and dissipation. This, Jesus identifies, is the syndrome that overtakes his brethren in the vineyard in the time just before he returns. And I'm sure it's one of the reasons that the command is given and the trumpet sounds and he comes back to earth. That, the cry of the poor, the violence of the earth, and the failure of every kind of known ideological government to have ever existed, are all the big picture of the reasons that he comes back. But this discord and dissipation is what's happening in the vineyard, to the point where he queries, will he find faith in the earth? This is what destroys it. And in the second letter, he's dealing with offenses and judgments. It's always about offenses and judgments. Make a judgment and see if it doesn't create an offense. Just make one assertion and watch the ecclesia go left and right down the aisle on the question of the judgment that has to be made. So offenses and judgments are nothing new. In the 10th verse of 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says, "For his letters, they say, are weighty and powerful." That was the offense. He wrote this letter, and it was so offensive. He's making all these judgments. He seems not even here, and he's telling us what to do. There were those in the ecclesia that came right back at him with this. But his bodily presence is weak, and his speech is contemptible. Well, what speech was that? Well, the speech that came to them in a letter. Those of them who had heard Paul speak, I'm sure he was not short on words, on any line of reasoning, spiritual reasoning that he put in them. It was his words, and probably the volume of his words. You know the length of his sentences just as much as I do. When Paul started to think, he just kept rolling with an idea. His critical reasoning kept on going right out to its outer extremity. That's what made his thinking effective. But it can be loathsome to people that can't stand somebody. Their best efforts to keep trying to use communication to reconcile. Same thing happened to Jesus, even though Jesus didn't have a problem with lengthy statements. He would put in a nutshell exactly what needed to be said, and that alone would detonate a hateful response from his enemies. He also says in the second letter, "For I consider that I'm not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles." He was even having doubts. He was trying to reassure himself and his hearers that, look, there are eminent apostles, the disciples of Christ. We know they were with him, but I saw him too. He picked me out. I didn't pick him out. He picked me out of the crowd. That was a judgment that was made against him. Well, he's inferior to this. I don't think Paul says. What does he know? He didn't walk with Jesus. He was there when Stephen was stoned. You going to listen to what he says? You know all that came up. He never lived it down. Even though I am untrained in speech, yet I am not in knowledge. So he's kind of re-examining himself. This is an interesting level of self-examination. So the offenses and judgments that they brought against him in the first letter was they swayed many brethren against him after he made his appeal to the ecclesia. You get this from the second letter. His change of plan meant that he was unreliable. He meant to be with them, and he had a change of plans. He couldn't come and visit them, and they held that against him. Oh, he's unreliable. They felt that he was a coward, and that must be because he's afraid to come here and face us in person. So he sends a letter. He's hiding behind his words. They actually suggested that he corrupted the word. You can get a copy of this later on if you like it. I don't have time to read these passages. It would be interesting if we did. He lacked the support of those in authority. So they felt like, well, Paul's sort of all on his own. And where's Peter? Is Peter backing him up here? How about James? James have anything to say about all this? Well, if they didn't, then why should we have any regard to what Paul's saying? They felt he was dishonest. And all of those were basically held against him. He had said, "I plead with you, brethren, by the name of the Lord, our Lord Jesus Christ, that you all speak the same thing." This is completely not natural. It's not natural even in your own mind, let alone with your wife or with your brethren or husband, or other brothers and other ecclesias. You all speak the same thing, that there be no divisions among you, but that you be perfectly joined together in the same mind and the same judgment. That same mind is the same mind as Christ. The only way we can have the same mind as Christ is to abandon our own feelings and opinions in deference to the mental disposition of Christ as it comes to us straight from the parables and the lessons and the things that he said, and Paul's and the other disciples' representation of what Jesus commanded. So here's what we all know is the sad truth. Sameness of mind and judgment is just not natural. The reason it's not natural is that it's spiritual, and things that are spiritual are just not natural. They don't come naturally to us. They're very uncomfortable. When we have to apply a principle to ourselves or in an ecclesia or in a marriage, it's not natural. It's going to be very uncomfortable. Just like every principle that Jesus applied in his ministry was uncomfortable to his adversaries. Very comfortable sometimes to the people he healed, but there were people looking at him going, who is this guy? Where does he think he gets his authority? Have they said that about you? Who do you think you are? You're not better than me. You're not the boss of me. I get my messages straight from him. When that comes up, it's typical because it's natural. This is the way we are wired by our nature. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time looking at the obstacles with some very important spiritual lessons that will come, the recognition, the observation of these obstacles as being innate in us all. We're wired this way, but that's what we're trying to transform in our effort to change and become like Christ. A transformation has to take place in each of us in order to fulfill, to circumvent these obstacles or manage them, however we want to put it. There's offenses and judgments, there's discord and disagreement, and there's this, variance and emulation. All right, let's take a pop quiz. You didn't know there was going to be a pop quiz today. Raise your hand if you're sure you know what variance and emulation are. Raise your hand. All right, everybody look around. This is horrifying. I don't see one person in the room that raises his hand. Okay, so that being the case, I think that we have enough people here. We have at least 30 people here. That's a reliable and predictable statistical curve. That would mean if you put all the Christadelphians together today in a room, and you said, raise your hand if you're sure you know what variance and emulation are, the likelihood is that there would be just a very, very few people, at least from this survey, who would know what they are. Well, how are you going to work with resistance to this in yourself if you don't know what this is? These are fruits of the flesh. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. Well, first let's go to offenses and judgment. The psalmist said, I think, foreshadowing what Jesus went through, obviously at the Last Supper, but maybe with a little bit of a more extended reference to our table of the Lord, where the breaking of bread is, where our fellowship is symbolized, where our greatest disparity is. The table of the Lord. But we split. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Roberts also said this in a nutshell. The record of ecclesial life. He didn't have a whole lot of experience, not the 107 years that we had. In order to draw this conclusion, he just had 40 years or so. The record of ecclesial life seems to be one of constant controversy. Why do you think he wrote the Ecclesial Guide? Why do you think he tried to solve a problem in a public debate? Because there was controversy then, just like there's controversy now, and there never will be a time in human existence where, like the government of the United States and the disparity between this nation and that nation, and all the marriages that break down, if you want to take it down to a smaller level, there will never be a time where there is not controversy. And you know Pride is the thing that drives it. Pride, only by pride comes contention. So offenses, it says, comes from hatred, not differences in judgment. So we should be able to have differences in judgment without assuming that my judgment is more righteous than yours. Differences, think about them, still love each other, not have any heartburn or lost sleep over differences in judgment. What messes it up is when it converts to a feeling of hatred. That's where the problem comes. How do we know that? Because Solomon said it's hatred that stirs up strife, not differences in judgment. It's the hatred that is the effect of pride acting upon differences in judgment that stirs up strife. On the other hand, in the spirit of Christ and a humble disposition, love covers all offenses. So there's a verse that will enable you to recognize hatred in yourself instead of thinking it is righteous indignation. There's a verse that puts it in a nutshell. Here it is. Watching for iniquity. Well, in this context, all that watch for iniquity are cut off. So if you go around the ecclesia, around the brotherhood, and you're just looking for iniquity, and you've got to pick up the phone and say, hey, I just saw somebody doing this. What are we going to do? If you're watching for it, not good. Sometimes you can't help but see it. Sometimes in arranging wars, this is mostly the case, it comes to you on its own, and you have to work it out. Sometimes it just erupts, kind of like a storm on a cloudy day, and there's nothing you can do about it except manage it. But watching for it is what the Pharisees did. They did it because it was driven from their hatred, and they did not recognize that watching for iniquity was unrighteous. In fact, they thought it was righteous. And they thought they found iniquity in the Lord Jesus Christ, right there in the Son of God. They were wrong. They were watching for it, and that was a work of the flesh. So that comes from hatred. So look out for that. To make a man an offender for it. Oh, what he said? Did you hear what he said? Well, who speaks perfectly except Jesus? Jesus spoke perfectly, but as far as I know, absent the inspiration of God in the Scriptures, no man speaks perfectly. We make mistakes with our words. We say things we don't mean. Don't hold something against your servant when you hear him cursing you, because you yourself know that you have cursed others. That's the problem. So hold back. If somebody says something and immediately that's an offense, there's hatred in you and you don't recognize it. You think that there's a problem with them in this offense. This is all in the same verse, by the way, in Isaiah 29:21. Those that lay a snare for him that reproves in the gate. This is what they did for Jesus with all their trick questions. There was one snare after another. They were trying to trap him to make something they could point to as an offense. They could take that offense and use it against him as a judgment. And then with that judgment, he said he was going to destroy the temple. He's got to go. You got to kill him. That's blasphemy. Did you hear it? It was blasphemy. He said he was going to destroy the temple. They laid a snare for him. And all he was doing was what his father bid him to do, is to reprove and negate. Brothers and sisters, this is what the older brothers in your ecclesia are attempting to do imperfectly. There's a part of ecclesial life where reproofs need to be made. They need to be made in love. They can't be made harshly. They need to be made gently. So a lot of self-control. You got to rule your spirit if you get into this mode. But if you are hugging your child saying you must never do that again, you know what it is to reprove in love. There's a lot of correction and reproof that comes from older brothers and sisters in an ecclesia that is an essential part of ecclesial life. So don't try to trap them in that. It's a sign of hatred. And the last one is turn aside the just for a thing of naught. Well, of course, that's what they did with Christ. They would take nothing and hold it against him. And in the end, turning him aside, being just as he was, perfect and blameless, they held a trial and accused him falsely and put him to death as a common criminal. For what? What was the crime? It wasn't there. It was a thing of naught. All that is a sign of hatred within. We need to recognize it in our own hearts, or we will be deceived into thinking that hatred is righteousness. Second one, discord and disagreement. Agree with one another. There's two problems that lead to discord between brethren and also in a marriage. One is being righteous over much. I think we kind of gloss over this line without realizing the impact it should have on our conscience, where we nitpick and take the slightest little thing and turn it into something so huge, a mountain that is an obstacle that fills up the ecclesia and pushes everyone out. This huge mound of trouble that comes from one little point that we think is just so righteous. And so Paul says, be not overly righteous. If there's those of you who knew my father, I think there's just a few people in here who did. If there was one thing my dad taught me by example, it was to not be righteous over much. You can let a lot of things go. You let them go in a marriage, you let them go in an ecclesia, we should let them go in the brotherhood. But when we kind of act like bear traps, and somebody's walking along, and with our righteousness, that trap springs, and we gotcha. Well, that messes, that puts somebody in a state they can't escape from. It stops bears and people from walking any further. So let's don't be righteous over much. He goes on to say, do not make yourself too wise. You may have all the verses in mind. You may have written great articles. You may have taught a lot of people the truth, but it's only us. We're not Christ. We're not on the throne yet. We're not perfected in righteousness. And so he says, why should you just destroy yourself the way the Pharisees did, essentially? Isn't that what he's saying? They were wise over much, overwise. And then he says this, and I think this is another little thing that we need to have a big look at in our times today. Going beyond what is written. He says, I've applied all these things to myself and Apollos for your benefit, brothers, that you may learn by us not to go beyond what is written. Well, how do we do that? Well, we add to what is written with our own writing. And we publish it, and people read it, and it becomes a subject of controversy. Isn't that how the whole thing started? There's a little red book written that went beyond what was written. And once you start trying to decipher what was written, pick apart those words, separate them, and add all your thoughts and opinions into them, some pretty serious influences can emerge into a whole ideology that actually has the power to split brethren for 170 years. If we had followed this advice, we never would have had the division. Happens in ecclesias, happens everywhere where opinions overtake simple principles or profound principles that are simply stated, and we go beyond what is written. Why do we do that? That none of you may be puffed up in favor of one against the other. That was the problem in Corinth, and that's the problem today whenever it happens. So there's the necessity for agreement and humility. Humility is the only disposition that makes this work. So he says, finally, brethren, in the second letter, finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration. Comfort one another. And he doesn't say, and hold on and disagree because iron sharpens iron. He doesn't say that right here. And that's not what iron sharpens iron means. Have you ever heard somebody use that to justify disagreement? Well, iron sharpens iron. So, if we take our swords and beat them against each other, they'll both be sharpened. Where's the logic in that? You know that can't happen. Two swords beating against each other does not make them both sharper. They get dull doing it. A lot of dents, and they're dull, and they're not even usable. That's not what that means. You know what it really means? Iron sharpens iron. It means that strength adds to strength. Two swords are better than one in an army. Strength adds to strength. So you take your strength and your judgment and add that to a brother's, the strength of his judgment, and those two judgments working together in Christ in unity will be stronger. As iron sharpens iron, strength adds to strength. So he says, instead, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. It is not natural to agree with one another. It's natural to disagree. Natural, not spiritual. agreement takes work. To bring ourselves to coalesce into mutual accord requires deliberate effort and agreement on all of our parts. And that requires some concession, some allowance for the bigger picture. These are ideals, and like I said, they're spiritual, so they're not natural, so they're not easy. All right, so let's get now here to the bottom line, variance and emulation. The two things that nobody here dared say they know what they are. Like I said, how are you going to work with this if you don't know what they are? They're fruits of the flesh. And guess where they come up? In this big long list that we point to over and over again as, well, this is what's wrong. When the flesh becomes asserted and manifested and overtakes us and a problem gets out of control and we don't know how to manage or handle it, and then look at what happened. There's a divorce, or there's a division, or there's all sorts of, take it out to the world, and James says what causes all this, but there's passions warring your members. So part of those passions are variance and emulations, right there in Galatians 5 and 19 and 20. So, what is that? In the house of God, controversy has caused an incalculable amount of suffering and loss of faith. Hold on. I didn't tell you what they are. I thought I had a slide on that, but I don't apparently. So now I'm going to have to just tell you. That's okay. If you're just listening, I'll just tell you, just listen, and we'll come together on this point. Variance is constant, habitual disagreement. It's oppositional defiance. There's a disorder called oppositional defiance disorder. So if every time somebody says something, you're in a meeting, you're hearing a talk, you're constantly thinking about how you disagree, and you can't have a conversation with saying, well, I don't know. I knew a person one time, every time I said something, he went, I don't know. And he went into a disagreement. Well, that's variance. Variance in legal terms is when, there's a law that says this is the limit, but you want to change that, you get a variance. All right, so sometimes we're talking about limits in conversations, and somebody comes along and they go, well, I don't know if that's the limit. What about that? Are you sure? Can't we wear this? Can't we do that? That's variance. It's constant, it's habitual. That's not a good thing. You know what that is? That's a work of the flesh, and it only comes from pride, and it causes a lot of contention. Emulation, you know what that is? Emulation is when there's bestmanship. Well, that was a good talk, but wait to hear mine. I know you had a lot, you got a lot on the ball, but wait till you get a load of me. I'll throw some principles that you never thought about. You may even think I'm doing that right now. But you see it in particular when brothers compete with each other for status. There should be no effort at status in an ecclesia whatever at all, period. Forget status. Status is what men in Congress do, and look at where they are. This isn't about status, it's about responsibility and accountability. So emulation, if we try to be better, you get in a discussion, a spiritual discussion, a brother says something, somebody else got to chase it. Every time he says something, somebody else got to come along with and capitalize on the point, kind of up the ante a little bit, make it just a little bit better of a point. Add his point of view. That's emulation. So he does that. Next guy comes along and he goes, well, not only that, but let me put it this way to you, and then you'll have a better understanding. This is what kids do. It's what people on television do in movies. It's what congressmen do, and it's what nations do, and it is a direct consequence of pride acting upon human nature. Variance, constant habitual disagreement, and emulation, which is bestmanship, should really not be named among us. So let's, now that we know what these words are on Sunday morning, when we shouldn't be examining everybody else, but examining ourselves, let's say, do I have any variance and emulation in my heart? Have I been using that in classes and in letters, among brothers, in the arranging board, wherever it is? Am I seeking status by being an eye servant and a men pleaser? Watch out for all those things, because they are subtle and they can be deceptive, as we know human nature is. So in the house of God, controversy has caused an incalculable amount of suffering and loss of faith. The conclusion then, and we're just about out of time, so I'm going to go through this quickly, is reconciliation. Reconciliation is imperfect now, but we can do it. We can sit down and have a heart-to-heart with somebody, and in that we can say, I love you. I'm sorry for all the things I've said. I didn't mean it that way. Let's try to understand each other. It can be some give and take. Taking a little bit of work. Sometimes it happens easily. But when it does, the clouds clear, the sun comes out again, and the world is suddenly beautiful. The breeze is fair, like will be in the kingdom. It's a morning without clouds. That's what reconciliation gives us. The beauty of a clear day. In the rainbow of the throne of Christ. So we're told in Revelation, immediately I was in the Spirit, and behold, a throne was set in heaven, and one sat on the throne. That was Christ. Heaven was the political heavens of the world now come into the kingdom of God. And there was a rainbow around the throne. That rainbow is the saints, the manifestation of God's covenant in the clouds that have now coalesced, not into just a cloud of witnesses in a human world, but a cloud of witnesses in a royal government, a righteous royal government, coalesce now around the throne. Let me show you what that looks like. This is the ultimate reconciliation. This is where we will all be together in the perfect peace and the clarity of the absence, the entire absence of any kind of conflict or disparity. I saw 24 elders clothed in white raiment, and they had heads on their heads, crowns of gold, and there were 7 lamps of fire burning before the throne, which are 7 spirits of God. They used to be 7 candlesticks, then they become 7 times 7 candlesticks in the churches, and around the throne, what used to be a little ecclesia is now a royal administration of the kingdom of God. And they're not little candles anymore. They are 7 spirits of fire that will bring the light of Christ into the whole world and fill it with his righteous law. And the consequence of that law, and the humility that comes from recognition of God's authority alone and righteousness alone, will be peace on earth and goodwill toward men. So in the middle of all that is the Son of God. Around him are 12 disciples ruling over the 12 tribes of Israel. Around them will be 24 elders. This is the kingdom. This is the administration that you're being trained to participate in. This is the throne of Christ. And around that, 7 spirits of fire around the throne. And that's when God sees this cloud in the heavens. And at that point, in the rising of Christ politically in this world with his government, every eye in the world will see him. This is what it looks like. Sideways. Throne of David. There are 12 thrones over the 12 tribes of Israel. There are 24 elders seated around the throne. And then below that, there's the building of an administration of people, men and women, whose minds were transformed to be like the mind of Christ. In all the tumbling and the conflict of offenses and judgments that we go through was a training that produced this. There's a count there. This is a literal count. Each one of those little squares is 100 people. There are 144,000 of them here. A number which is either literal or symbolic. But if there are 144,000 saints that make up the royal administration, and there are millions of doorkeepers in the kingdoms, that's still in the kingdom, isn't it? I don't know how to interpret that number, but it's a number that's been given to us. And all this is just a close, realistic look at what will have taken all these things that we've worked with in ecclesial life, in our marriages and conflicts, and the growth and stretching that occurs as a result of it, and the righteous realizations that come of it, and the good judgments that are preserved, that are transferred to that day. All of this makes up that throne, which will be the throne of Christ in the kingdom, and that's what you are doing. That's why we're thinking about this morning, because this is where we are going. You're a chosen generation. You're a royal priesthood, a holy nation. You're his own special people, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light.